Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. Today, our guest is Richard Steele, author of Elevated Economics. Richard, welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it. Nice to be with you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. As I told you before, your book is terrific. It's one of those books that you can't put down. So it's really, really well done. Of course, I love books with lots of information in it. So that's probably what I like the most about it. So please tell us about your professional background and what you're doing right now.
Oh, thanks, Mark. I appreciate the kind words. So currently, I'm the CEO of a company called Parsec Ventures. And in my past, I've run both private companies and public companies. I've been an advisor to the White House Business Council, advised the Biden team on economic policy and on innovation policy. I was named one of Inc. magazine's fastest growing company CEOs, member and former chair of YPO, which is a Young Presidents Organization, and alumnus of Harvard Business School, where I currently serve on the Harvard Business School Alumni Board, among many other board positions. And I wrote Elevated Economics, spent about 2 years researching and writing that book. And I'm actually very proud to say it recently won Book of the Year in economics.
Oh, well, congratulations. That's great. And clearly all the other things you told us, you know what, you have a lot of extra time on your hands. So I'm expecting more production from you in the future. That's for sure. But why did you write this book?
Yeah, so, I spend a lot of time talking with business leaders and folks in government about how business and society are changing and what leadership will look like in the near future. We're always trying to, see around the next curve. And, recently, as we all know, things have been accelerating at a very fast pace. So I decided to really delve into the events that are shaping these changes and kind of what the natural progression is, where we're going to go, sort of what they call, discovering the inevitable and uncovering the inevitable. And, this past summer, I was on a rafting trip where the Colorado River and the Roaring Fork River meet. And the point at which two rivers meet is called a confluence. But the term confluence is only used when the rivers that meet are of similar size. Otherwise, if it's a smaller river, they're called a tributary. And in the same way, we've been seeing a lot of similarly sized events happening in our country and abroad, and we see them affecting the business community in really, really profound ways, right? And those events that have contributed to that change are things like racial injustice and climate change and diversity and inclusion issues and new regulations, change in investing habits and consumption habits of the next generation, and all that with a backdrop of accessibility and ubiquity of information. And I think that people's concerns haven't been getting addressed by government. And when the public sector fails, the responsibility of leadership falls to the private sector largely. And change is really being driven like never before, I think, at the consumer level and at the investor level. And firms are forced to answer the call. So that's why I wrote this book, to delve into those issues.
I think that's because people are getting information faster and from more sources now than in any time in history. And so things that took a while for us to get to us, or things that we just relied on in a couple places, now there's just ubiquitous information. Whether it's true or not true, that's another question, but there's tons of stuff that's out there. But what is your definition of an elevated economy?
Yeah, so one where the negative externalities that companies have been foisting on the rest of the world in pursuit of an extra buck are no longer tolerated and no longer even attempted, really. One where impact is measured and we engage in impact weighted accounting on the firm side, where one where capitalism thrives, but it really considers all stakeholders, not just shareholders. And I'll make an observation here. When Harvard Business School was created, the dean at that time was a guy named Edwin Gay, and he said the purpose of business is to make a decent profit decently. And I think that's what sensible investors will demand of the firms that they back. Bill Salmon, who's a professor at HBS, said the same thing. And it's that word decently, to make a decent profit decently. And it seems as though somehow we've gotten away from that over time. There's a whole variety of reasons for that, but I think that an elevated economy kind of goes back to that definition of making a decent profit decently.
And there was a time when company CEOs felt a real obligation to do the right thing for society. And I think because of people wanting returns so quickly, that's changed some of the equation. You provide this great metaphor regarding what happened with Chernobyl, and you say the global economy is soon to cross the red line. Can you explain this metaphor you used and what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. So it's in chapter 1. I think it's on the first page of the book, and it's this idea that we think about Chernobyl and we think about this spectacular explosion, this one singular event, and of course that's true, that did happen, but I think the real story is what led up to that event, right? So years and years and years of mistakes, ego, pressure, both literally and figuratively. And this idea of slow leaks, right? These leaks that were tolerated, these problems that were overlooked, swept under the rug, that folks hoped would go away, right? Until, of course, the unavoidable was upon them, right? And then, of course, the rest of the world had to deal with it as well. So I think that it's sort of that boiling frog metaphor as well. If you turn, if the frog's in a pot of boiling water and it starts off cold and you raise it one degree at a time, the frog never realizes sort of until it's too late. And that's what's happened. That's what happened with Chernobyl, and that's what's happened with, I think, the global economy in relation to those things that I mentioned before. Climate change specifically, racial injustice, diversity, inclusion, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that is sort of where we are as a society and sort of how we got there as well. And so this is a real point of reckoning that we're in right now today.
Why don't you think people get climate change? Because it makes me think about, like, if I were explaining it to especially the last president who wasn't a believer in the climate change, that's like him being in the Oval Office with just he and I speaking, and it's nice and cool and comfortable. But if we put 200 people in the Oval Office together, then it becomes heated up and uncomfortable. So why do you think people really don't get it about climate change?
Sure, when something's really in front of your face, right? If your house is on fire, you understand that, right? You act quickly. But if things are incremental, like that boiling frog metaphor we just used with Chernobyl, when things are incremental, people aren't forced to act in that moment. It's also easier to do nothing than it is to do something. But that's all changing, right? And we're seeing whether it's regulatory pressure, consumer pressure, companies behaving the right way. It's changing, and I think we've got to a point now where everybody understands. Well, almost everybody understands that we need to make these changes.
So maybe in schools they need to start teaching people younger about this, because it is impacting business and not just society in general, and what kind of businesses these folks will go into, what kind of skill sets they're going to need, all those types of things. So you think this should start being taught at a very young age?
Well, it's interesting, Mark. So I think that when we're talking about climate change and people doing nothing and sort of the immediacy of it, I think we're talking about people of maybe your and my generation, because it's completely different with younger generations. I was actually at a business school reunion, and there are multiple graduation years that attend the reunion. So you'll have men and women in their 60s and 70s come to a reunion with the younger folks, and we were in a session taught by Vikram Gandhi, a great professor there, and one of the gentlemen that was in the class brought his daughter, and the sort of case discussion that we were having was about climate change and what companies should do and sort of if they should act and all the rest of it. And I was really hoping that this young woman, the daughter, she's probably maybe 20 or so of one of the guys that was there, would speak. And finally she did. And she said, listen, you guys are debating if, like, that's not the question, right? Like, the question is how, like, how do we do this now? Not if we should. So it was just this great moment where The younger generation was literally speaking to the older generation, really underscoring the fact that this is just not how they think, not how they behave, not how they invest. And we were just a bunch of dinosaurs, right? Talking and arguing amongst ourselves about a topic that had already been decided by the next generation.
What are from your research are consumers most dissatisfied with today? And please tell about the signals of change. You write about that in the book.
Yeah, sure. So let's go to your first question first. I think when you talk about the dissatisfaction, there was a really great Nielsen study that asked the question. They asked the question, state your level of agreement with this statement. It is extremely or very important to me that companies implement programs to support the environment, right? Baby boomers, about 62% of them agreed with that statement. Gen X was 66%, millennials, 83%. So just right there, you have a great study by one of the best research institutions. And by the way, the list goes on and on and on. So I would say dissatisfaction. Climate change is usually the top of the list. There are lots of others, but climate change is usually top of the list. And then we talk about signals of change. I would say just, again, I'm really a data-driven person. So when you look at actual actions, things that have actually happened, the consequences if companies don't change, you look at employee activism, right? In response to climate inaction by their firms, Amazon Employees for Climate Justice was formed, and they staged a walkout. They walked out of the Amazon headquarters. And when they walked out of the Seattle headquarters of Amazon, they were joined by employees from Google, from Microsoft, from Apple, from Facebook. And guess what? A few months later, Amazon pledged $2 billion to the climate crisis, right? You had Wayfair employers refusing to work because they didn't want their company to sell mattresses to the government, who was planning on using them at their detention facility at the border, the whole kids in cages thing. You've had Google employees refusing to work on projects for the military. So that's one set of facts on the employee activism side. But you also have consumers voting with their dollars and shunning brands that don't align with their values. So Unilever just spent €1 billion attempting to align its products with its customers' values, and they're spending that money on ways to cut fossil fuels from their detergents, right? And the list goes on and on and on. But just to give you some examples, real world implications, set of facts, there you have them right there.
You write about corporate and investor focus on ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Is that getting widespread or just niche appeal? And how is that affecting consumer buying habits?
Sure. So another set of facts, in 2019, there were 500 ESG funds that folks could buy. 2020, that number was 2,700 funds. And the number's gone up from there. If you look at the younger generation, these things are table stakes, ESG. So let's talk about ESG for a second. So environmental, social, and governance practices. So environmental, that's kind of the easy one to understand, right? Air emissions and air quality, energy use, conservation, waste management, water quality, things like that. What do companies do to protect the natural environment? On the social side, that's relationships with employees, suppliers, clients, communities. So examples are, local community impact and labor standards, employee relations, production quality, safety issues around production, equal employment opportunities, right? So that's on the social side. And governance really is, how does a company behave? What are their standards for leadership within the company? What are their risk controls, shareholder rights, ethical business practices, voting rights, executive pay versus employee pay, things like that. So when we're talking about ESG, it's environmental, social, and governance. Those are the things that we are talking about. And it is getting a broad-based appeal, as evidenced by a whole set of numbers, some of which I mentioned at the top. But I'll stop there, but I could go on. Long answer to a short question.
No. And I thought it was good answer, and it needs to be a thorough answer for people to really grasp the significance of this, because especially as we've seen that the guy in Brazil has been chopping down some of the rainforest, and what's effect that's going to have. And we're seeing floods all over, even in Philadelphia. We had a flood that shut down a main artery that nobody had ever seen ever. ever, and was 15 feet high of water in a main artery that nobody could believe. And we're seeing more of this on a continuous basis more frequently. 500-year floods are now happening regularly, which is unbelievable. Socially responsible investing has been around a long time, but usually reserved for tree huggers. Is this becoming more mainstream, and how much attention do CEOs and boards have to pay to this?
Sure. And so, Mark, for your listeners, not viewers, I'm sitting here smiling as you say tree hugger, because I go through a whole set of research, and I have a slide in my deck of a woman with her arms around a tree, eyes closed, very sort of meditative pose. And we talk about the implied trade-off between investing in ESG focused funds or individual companies. And the research shows that there absolutely is no trade-off. So, and in fact, some of those companies do better in the long run. So, and let me just quote some stats quickly. Morgan Stanley asks, can you invest sustainably without sacrificing financial returns? Research conducted on the performance of nearly 11,000 mutual funds from 2004 to 2018 show that there's no financial trade-off in the returns of sustainable funds compared to traditional funds, and that they demonstrate lower downside risk. Barron's, same thing. Sustainable companies return more to shareholders. So shares of the Barron's 100 most sustainable companies returned 34.3% on average last year. The S&P returned 31.5%, right? So that's that. Morningstar, same thing. Sustainable funds and indexes perform on par with comparable conventional funds and indices, despite theories suggesting otherwise. So there is this myth that there is some trade-off. But let's get back to your question. And when we're talking about socially responsible investing or ESG, and sort of, is it becoming mainstream? And I think you asked how much attention CEOs and boards are paying to this. Well, so on 8/19/19, which is what I call in my book, I have a whole chapter on this, called "The Day the Shareholders Died." A little bit tongue in cheek, but here's why we talk about that. Shareholder value is no longer everything, top CEOs say. So that was the headline in the New York Times. Shareholder value is no longer everything, top CEOs say. So I read that and I thought, my gosh, right? Like, who are these like left-wing nut job CEOs that say shareholder value is no longer everything, right? What about Milton Friedman and his whole theory of shareholder primacy, which states that the purpose of a corporation is to return value to shareholders, and really at all cost is sort of the subtext there. So I'm thinking, who are these leaders that say this? So I delved a little bit deeper into this, and it turns out that it's Jeff Bezos of Amazon, and Mary Barra of General Motors, and Larry Fink of BlackRock, and Julie Sweet from Accenture, and Brian Moynihan from Bank of America, and Tim Cook from Apple, of course, and Robert Smith of Vista Equity Partners, and 133 other CEOs of America's biggest companies that agreed with this statement that shareholder value is no longer the top priority of business, right? I mean, huge. Doug McMillon, he's the CEO of Walmart, right? He's part of this group as well. And the group is the Business Roundtable. So this is the Business Roundtable, 140 CEOs of America's biggest companies. Again, I mentioned a few of them already, but we're talking, Jamie Dimon as well of JP Morgan, and Beth Ford from Land O'Lakes, and Johnson CEOs, Marriott, Accenture, Boston Consulting Group. The list goes on and on and on. And so they have put out this statement. So to your question, right, they put out this statement saying, here's the new purpose of a corporation. And there were 5 things. And in order, by the way, here are the 5 things. Number 1, delivering value to customers. Okay. Number 2, investing in our employees. And that's talk about, training and education and things like that. Okay. Number 3, dealing fairly and ethically with our suppliers. That was bullet point number 3 in the statement of the purpose of what a corporation is and does. Number 4, supporting the communities in which we work. And the very last one, the 5th one, the last one, generating long-term value for shareholders, not short-term value, long-term value for shareholders. So this is an organization that the Business Roundtable that overturned its 22-year-old policy statement that defined a corporation's principal purpose as maximizing returns to shareholders. And they replaced it with this stakeholder-centric purpose. These stakeholders, right? Customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and shareholders, right? So here's what the CEOs of literally the largest companies in America had to say is the new purpose of big business. So that's a big deal, right? So when you say that, is this becoming mainstream, and how much attention do CEOs and boards have to pay to these ideas around socially responsible investing? It's here to stay. It's absolutely mainstream. And yes, everybody needs to sit up and pay a lot of attention. And if you're in a leadership position in your business, or aspire to be in a leadership position in your business, you can really help your company, your firm, by understanding these principles of ESG and purpose-driven businesses. And to use the Wayne Gretzky quote, get your firm to skate to where the puck is going, that future state, rather than where it is right now. I'll stop there. I have a tendency to go on, so I'll stop there.
No, but it was a good answer. And it made me think myself, as I'm sure other people are listening to this, think that they have to do that, because of the internet and people having more choices now than ever on products, on job opportunities. If they don't align, then I can just go and work for somebody in Los Angeles, even though I live in Philadelphia or I live in Sweden. The smartest people aren't locked in to wherever they are physically, regionally. They can go anywhere for this stuff. And the more, and for the companies themselves, the bigger the disaster bills are, the higher insurance that they're paying, the more the costs are. So it's got to be aligned with the success for shareholders anyway, right?
I believe so. And whether or not it's the right thing to do, the consumers and investors and governments will push firms to get there. So a couple of headlines from CNBC. It says move over FANG, right? Which is an acronym for some of the big tech companies. It says move over FANG. The next decade of investing will be defined by ESG. So says Morgan Stanley. Barron's had an article with the headline that said sustainable fund assets hit 1.2 trillion as ESG continues to gain market share. Sustainable investing in ESG is something that everybody should be considering, because you can have an impact as well as return. This was the head of BNP Paribas Asset Management. BlackRock's Larry Fink says investors are shifting to ESG focused firms in droves, right? And they're really leading the charge on that. Social bonds are serving. Endowments of huge institutions and pension funds are limiting their investments in companies and firms that are engaged in extraction, right? Think oil and gas, mining companies, things like that. You've got Walmart. We talked about Doug McMillon a second ago. Walmart set a goal almost a year ago today to become a regenerative company. So that means that they will restore, renew, and replenish the natural environment, not just conserve or get to zero emissions, which they also announced. And then you've got governments as well, and banks. By the way, let's talk about banks for a second. HSBC and a whole bunch of other banks have set zero net finance emissions target, meaning they won't finance or they won't lend money to firms that impact greenhouse gas emissions. So think drilling in the Arctic, mining, coal exploration, things like that. And so that's the banks, that's consumers, that's firms, and then you've got governments as well. So you've got San Francisco that has banned natural gas in any new construction, so any new apartment, new houses. They only have electric, not gas. They phased out the sale of new electric cars in 2040, and then New York followed suit just, I think, 2 weeks ago. So you will not be able to buy a new car with an internal combustion engine in the state of California or New York in 2040, only electric. The examples go on and on and on. Last thing, you really know it's getting serious when the accountants get involved. So if all those headlines kind of weren't enough, I think you really know the ESG has arrived when the big four accounting firms endorse official ESG reporting standards, which has just happened. Deloitte, Ernst & Young, KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers. That's a big deal. That's when you know it's getting really, really serious.
A question from the audience. What are the three policies that are quantitatively reversing global warming?
What are three policies that quantitatively reduce global warming? Well, I think that when you look at the greening or electrification of the grid, that's really huge, right? And so a lot of governments around the world, not just in the U.S., are moving to that in that direction. The construction industry is huge. The construction industry, especially concrete, produces huge amounts of CO2, and anything, of course, that targets methane as well. I was actually talking to a construction industry roundtable group a few months ago. So the steps that they are taking to curb their greenhouse gas emissions are huge. And then methane, which is 80 times worse as a heat trapping gas, anything that can curb methane leaking into the atmosphere is huge. I was just talking with a firm with a brand new technology that can detect methane leaks in oil and gas refining facilities in real time. So typically you might have literally a person with a clipboard walking around once every 6 months saying, oh, you need to tighten this valve, kind of a thing, versus a technological solution that can detect in real time. So anyway, I hope that answers the question, but yeah, those are some things that come to mind.
And another question from the audience: in effort to support your local community and grow manufacturing jobs, is it wise to point out many foreign countries are less than friendly to the environment?
Absolutely. So the great outsourcing experiment of the last 60 years for post World War II, where we as consumers in the United States can benefit from inexpensive products. But if you stop and think just for a second about, well, why is this product inexpensive? And a lot of times it's because it was made with child labor, or because the firm that made it is located overseas and their environmental standards are not as strict. So they can make a product more cheaply and get it to us than we could make it here because of some of these regulatory things we've been talking about. And I think more and more you see consumers making the choice to buy products that have more responsible packaging. And then if you look at just the kite marks on products, the kite marks are those little icons on consumer packaged goods that say things like, fair trade, if you're thinking about coffee, for example, right? So fair trade coffee or chocolate, meaning that the people that have made it have been paid a living wage. You'll see things that are not only kosher or vegan or non-GMO, right? But sustainable seas or sustainably farmed, right? Dolphin safe, I remember, was a big thing even a few decades ago, and still to this day. So consumers have this is really the beautiful thing. This is the thing that it gives me hope so much, is that we've all had the power this whole time to make these changes. We can all vote with our dollars, right? And if, as a class, consumers end up putting their dollars where their mouth is, right? Voting with their dollars by buying products that align with their values, and specifically shunning products that don't align with their values. Of course, that will make corporate America change, right? So I think that is really the optimistic part of all this, is that we've had the power the whole time, and we're just kind of waking up to it more so nowadays, maybe than in decades past.
The pocketbook drives everything.
Absolutely.
Another question from the audience: what are the best ESG funds to invest in your opinion? So, or they should be aware of?
Sure. So I am not a stock picker, and it's not appropriate for me to give advice, but I will say that there are green bonds and sustainable bonds. There's a really interesting group called the Working Forest Fund, which people can look at. And that was a really unique security. It was brought to the investment grade bond market. It's called the Working Forest Fund, and their goal is to address climate change, conservation, and economic resilience through forest conservation in the United States. So they went out with Goldman Sachs, raised 150 million in 2019, and the green bond proceeds that invested were about 131 million out of that 150 million. There are a whole bunch of SDG ETFs. SDG stands for Sustainable Development Goals. So the United Nations came out with 17 goals, and they're all color coded and numbered. And so they're like, goal number 1 is no poverty. Goal number 2 is zero hunger. Goal number 13 is climate action. Goal number 6 is clean water and sanitation. So there's 17 numbered and color coded goals. And you can say, okay, here's what's important to me, and I would like to invest accordingly. And almost any wealth management firm or brokerage firm will be able to very, very easily now, it wasn't the case a few years ago, but very, very easily now, drive your investments towards aligning with your values. So there's SDG ETFs, like Impact Share Sustainable Development Goals ETF, it's SDGA. There's Serenity Shares, there's an SSI Impact Index. iShares has a MSCI Global Impact ETF. So there's those sorts of securities. There are other mutual funds, so Federated SDG engagement. It's FHESX. There's Cornerstone Capital Group that has a whole bunch of SDG funds. And then there's even public companies that are B Corps, right? So there's Silver Chef, Ben & Jerry's, Sundial, which is a Unilever company, New Chapter, which is P&G, Laureate Education. So they're actually public companies that are B Corps. And then there's, iShares, right? So there's ETFs that you can buy that really understand that this idea that climate risk represents investment risk, right? Just like you were talking about before, Mark, with these insurance companies.
Yep.
And that it's moved from from a novelty in the investment world to something that's really approaching mainstream, right? And you've got an estimated, I think, 50 to 100 trillion in capital invested that's required to will be required to rebuild a net zero global economy, right, by 2050, so the next 29 years. And we think that financial markets are beginning to appreciate the potential impact of this shift towards sustainability. So I'll stop there, but yes, there are lots, and I'm happy to answer questions offline and put some stuff in the show notes for people to help them with the research.
Yeah, and we'll give you the email addresses of everybody who participated and signed up for this program, so you can reach them directly. Explain how the 4 Ps, product, price, place, and promotion, have added a 5th P, purpose. How does that impact sellers and buyers?
Sure thing. So purpose is really everything. When you think about who wins in the elevated economy, it's those folks that are running purpose-led businesses. And let me pause and give an example. If you think about Tom's Shoes, right? They're a shoe company that when you buy a pair of shoes, they donate a pair of shoes to somebody in need. So the 4 Ps are product, price, place, and promotion. And this 5th P, purpose, is really everything. I mean, of course, you have to have the first 4, but when you talk about how purpose impacts buyers and sellers, think about your willingness to pay for a product that aligns with your values. The idea about what you're willing to pay for from an identity and a purpose standpoint is huge. And as a firm, as a company, you can really drive willingness to pay by imbuing your product with purpose, imbuing your company with purpose. It has to be genuine, of course, but we all learned about willingness to pay in business school, right? So it's abbreviated as WTP, willingness to pay, and it's the maximum price that somebody's willing to pay for a product or for a service. And it can vary significantly from one person to the next, right? Makes sense. But the variance is often caused by differences in either extrinsic or intrinsic values. So extrinsic differences are observable, right? Things you can generally determine about a person without needing to ask them. So age, gender, income, education, things like that, where they live. Intrinsic differences, on the other hand, are persons' characteristics that you wouldn't know without asking them directly, right? So they're kind of hard to observe. So these unobserved differences are, I think, an opportunity for companies with purpose to drive willingness to pay. And I'm not saying that some of these factors should be used solely to drive willingness to pay, but as a result of a company behaving well, having a purpose, having a mission, you can get companies that like Saatchi & Saatchi would really rely on a thing called love marks. And that was when somebody was so fanatical about a brand that they would evangelize about that brand. So when you think about ESG or sustainability being linked to purpose, like in the Tom shoes example, I buy a pair of shoes and some kid gets who's in need gets a pair of shoes as well. I feel really good about that. I actually feel fantastic about that. Not only do I feel fantastic about that, but I am branding myself as somebody who believes that is important by wearing those shoes with the little logo right on the shoes. So purpose-led businesses can really increase a consumer's willingness to pay by promoting their products to match extrinsic and intrinsic differences, those two differences we talked about. And the huge changes that we've seen take place in regards to climate change and social justice, et cetera, are really, they're huge opportunities. Again, another reason to be optimistic. They're huge opportunities for firms to increase willingness to pay. So just consider again for a second those kite marks and the messaging you see on just about every consumer product: sustainably sourced, recycled, earth-friendly, non-GMO, organic, fair trade, right? The list goes on and on. So I hope that answers the question. Again, another long answer to a short question, but I do think critically about a lot of this stuff, and I think that those are some hopefully helpful examples.
Oh, no, they were excellent examples. Companies have been focused on short term for a few decades. Are we seeing a shift to long-term thinking? And what if the companies can't make their numbers? I mean, I think that's what worries me most, because you mentioned the beginning of this, companies taking a longer term view, and you mentioned very prominent CEOs and household name companies. But what if they don't make their numbers, and it's cheaper just to go and break the laws of, you know, what you're hoping to do for the future, for the environment and the world in general? What happens then?
Sure. So we talked about the business roundtable, and we talked about short-termism versus the long-term value, right? Generating long-term value for shareholders, which was the fifth bullet point in the 5 bullet points of the new purpose of a corporation, according to those 140 CEOs of America's largest companies. So we talked about that a couple of minutes ago. This is really all about the narrative that investors are being given. So consider real-world example. Walmart and Amazon. They basically do the same thing. They're the everything store to everybody, right? You can get anything at Walmart, you can get anything and everything at Amazon.
Yep.
The story that Bezos told investors for 20 years is, hey, we're not going to generate a return for you for 20 years. We're not going to generate a return for you for 20 years, but we will build the everything store, right? And the equity in those shares is going to increase massively over time. Walmart's narrative, on the other hand, was different. We will generate return for shareholders every quarter, right? So it's conditioning the investor class with the right narrative, and you can have success either on the one side or on the other side. And I think that the game is changing, not just the narrative. So you've got investors and consumers demanding that change, and companies are going to have to answer it in an ethically and genuine manner, and they are going to have to stick to their guns. You know, Climate Week, which is every September, right, this month, usually results in a lot of companies come out with these pledges, right? Last year, Walmart pledged to become a regenerative company. We talked about that a little bit ago. And you had, a whole range of companies declaring that they'd be carbon neutral by a certain date. You had China at Climate Week in New York City saying that they will be zero emission by 2060. The country of China, right? I mean, massive, massive, massive news. Now, and we talked about the ubiquity of information before, it's up to the free press and all of us to keep these folks honest with their pledges. There's some great work by Barron's on this. There's some fantastic work by Bloomberg. They actually have a little chart that shows where firms are on the progress towards the goals that they themselves have set. So I think that once those flags have been planted in the ground, you're going to see consumers, investors, and the press holding their feet to the fire over time.
What new training and skills do CEOs need now? Because it seems to me that they're going to need more than what they used to need. And every year, it seems like there are more and more skill sets that they're going to need to run these companies and achieve these goals that you talked about.
Yeah, sure. So identifying and uncovering the inevitable. In my book, Elevated Economics, the first few chapters lay out the set of facts, just numbers. Here's where everything is going. Here is where these plots are on a graph, and you can map the trajectory of where a lot of these issues are going. So you can understand where the future state is. And you can understand, we used the Wayne Gretzky metaphor before, right? Skate to where the puck is going, not to where it is. You can understand where the puck is going. Now that you know that, whether you're an employee at the company, an executive, CEO, whatever, you can leverage that. You can help your firm leverage ESG and purpose to your advantage. You know what the future state is. You know what the inevitable is. So now just get there. And how do you get there? How do you do that in a genuine way? So I think that as far as training and the skills that CEOs need, of course, they always need to be lifelong learners. That's absolutely critical. Understanding the changes in consumer and investor behavior, what the next generation is going to demand of you, you can really set your firm up for success, and you can actually be a leader in this area. You think about the great wealth migration, $68 trillion, that's trillion with a T, $68 trillion of wealth are going to be transferred from the baby boomer and older generations to millennials and younger generations. Those younger generations invest and spend completely differently than those older generations. 80% of them are going to look for a new wealth manager, right? 80% of them, right? These are the folks that are going to be driving all that change, and they're not going to be investing in companies or mutual funds that are comprised of firms behaving badly. And so understanding that should give you the motivation to change. Learning about ESG and some of these other things that we've been talking about today should inspire you in your firm to sort of get to that future state as quickly as possible, tell a genuine story about it without greenwashing, and greenwashing being, you say you're doing things, but you're not actually doing them. So genuinely sort of getting to that future state and evangelizing, right? Telling the world how good you are, right? And that goes back to that Tom's example, Tom Shoes that we talked about before. Let people feel good about doing business with you. Let them become an evangelist for your brand because of who your company is, not what it sells.
We have read a significant migration from cities to suburbs over the last year, but you write about the trend toward megacities. How will future pandemics affect this?
Sure. So yeah, we talked about climate change and something being right in front of your face and taking action on it. And I think that it's very, very similar to what's happening with the pandemic right now. Obviously, very, very serious. But if you look back to the flu pandemic of 1908, it didn't result, or sorry, 1918 didn't result in mass migration to rural areas, and neither will COVID. So I think short term, yes. Long term, no. I would say in March and April, of 2020, there was all this, will we ever shake hands again? Will we ever be in the same room? Travel's dead, conferences are dead, everything was right, never again. And the sky was falling, and it was, it felt that way for sure. But I think at least in my experience, right, as soon as I was 3 weeks past my second shot, and I knew that the person across from me was as well, we were hugging and handshaking and doing all the things that that we've done in the past. So I think that those are short-term headlines, and I don't think that long-term that it'll impact the trend towards moving to megacities.
What role will cryptocurrency play in the future, and should we be buying, spending, and accepting it? 'Cause I'm still not sure I understand, and I've had a few authors on the show that talked about cryptocurrency, and I'm still not sure I understand what its value is, considering it's based on the dollar or some other denomination. It's not like based on cattle or something strange. It's already still based on that.
Sure.
So what's your take on this?
Well, yeah. So I've been asked for stock picks and now crypto. So let me back off yet again. I'm not qualified to recommend any particular cryptocurrencies or anything like that.
I wasn't
However,
thinking
here's what I
about the
will say.
recommending of the cryptocurrency, but like, what's the role cryptocurrency is going to be playing in buying, spending, and accepting? Because now there was
Yeah.
even a country that saying we'll accept cryptocurrency, and you have some big organizations are saying you'll be able to use it to buy products. So are they stunts, or is this for real for the future?
Yeah, so a couple of things. I would say that we would make the distinction between the blockchain and currencies that are built on the blockchain. And so I think, the blockchain is very important and very good in so many ways. And one of those ways is the disintermediation of middlemen, right? And democratizing finance. Those are good things. Banking the unbanked is a good thing. Smart contracts are a good thing. Decentralized cloud storage, that makes a ton of sense, right? And I think that stable coins represent a real opportunity in crypto, right? So the aim of stable coins is to become sort of global fiat-free digital cash, right? And if you look at the opportunity there, the total addressable market, or TAM, as we talk about, it's all the money in the world, right? I mean, that's a total addressable market, right? It's $90 trillion. So the opportunity, I think, for stable coins is intrinsically, it's the largest possible TAM. Over about the last year or so, they've grown from 17 billion to 116 billion. They found clear product market fit. They act, as a base in crypto trading. They're being used for cross-border payments, remittances, right? I mean, so think about folks who maybe they're in the United States and they send money back to a foreign country. Let's take Mexico as an example. In the old days, you go to Western Union would charge some exorbitant percent to be able to act as that middleman so those funds could be transferred. Now you can do it completely disintermediating that middleman. And that's better, of course, because the money goes directly to the person it's intended to, and they can spend it in their economy. So I think those things are good things. I think that there's been a lot of discourse around scaling blockchains and the limiting factors of the transaction per second or TPS. And so, we've been talking about Ethereum, which supports about 15 to 30 transactions per second. Binance is about 160. Solana, which has got a lot of attention recently, supports up to 50,000 transactions per second. So you see investors have invested billions of dollars to scale some of these things on the blockchain, and they are necessary technologies for the future. So yes, I mean, I believe crypto is here to stay. We could do a whole nother hour on this. So I do think it's here to stay. I do think it provides a valuable service, and it gets the blockchain in general gets more productive capacity to more people through the act of disintermediation. So I'll leave it there. I hope that wasn't Greek to people.
No, I thought that was helpful. There's a very interesting question about consumers you asked. What was, and it was, which was, what identity are our customers protecting? What do you mean by this, and why would they be protecting their identity?
Yeah, sure. So there are five principles related to identity as it relates to consumer behavior and how businesses can kind of leverage it to plan sales, marketing, and product development and things like that, right? All those various strategies. And there was a paper published by the economics and marketing professors from University of Pennsylvania, where you are, and the University of Washington. And they studied this phenomenon, and they basically came down to identify five principles, and they are the identity salience principle, the identity relevance principle, the identity verification principle, and the identity conflict principle. So basically, it takes a consumer from establishing what their identity is as a person, as a consumer in society, and then all the way to what happens when there is some friction there and there's a conflict. So let me explain a little bit. When you're at, your question was, what identity are customers protecting? So that fifth principle in that joint study that I mentioned talked about identity conflict. And so by the time a consumer reaches the end of the identity adoption process, meaning they fully understand sort of who they are, they've reached sort of this, what I call semi-walled state, right? Their goal for their identity, once they've associated with it and verified it, is to protect it, right? So to give you an example, they're not buying a Patagonia jacket just to see if it lives up to the hype. And if it's a good warm jacket, they're buying it because of how well it supports their identity as an environmentally conscious, financially successful person, and they're trying to blend those identities, right? So once you've decided to become an identity-driven company, the next step is to identify with as much clarity as possible which identities your key consumers are already protecting, right? So how do you sort of get over that wall and that walled state, or at least be let through the door because the identity of your firm matches the identity of the consumer. So there's a lot more to it. I'll kind of leave it there. Happy to go into a little bit more depth if you'd like.
No, it's good. There's been a ton of research featured in the Harvard Business Review, which is by far my favorite magazines, and people hear that all the time, about the value of diverse leadership and the return on investment. Has the same held true for companies that focus on the triple bottom line, social, environmental, and financial? And do you have some good examples?
Yeah, sure. So when companies are focused on ESG, or as you talk about triple bottom line, part of that is going to be on the social side, and diversity falls into that bucket. So when we're talking about ESG, different things fall in different buckets. The diversity stuff falls in the S of ES and G, and also sometimes in G in governance, as far as the makeup of the board and things like that. So there was a story that was printed in the Telegraph, and it really zeroed in on the definitions and importance of diversity and inclusion. And they were basically saying that, look, very simply, diversity can be seen as a means of differentiating people from one another, right? Gender, ethnicity, et cetera. But there's a firm called the Global Diversity Practice, and there's a woman there named Farah, and she was saying that, look, it's about respecting and appreciating differences, and the key question for companies is how to leverage those differences, right? Those different lifestyles, perspectives, and backgrounds to drive business success, right? To drive business innovation. So it's not tokenism, right? You want to stay away from that. It's understanding that. I'll use myself as an example, right? If I'm in a boardroom and it's comprised of 10 other mid-40s white guys, that doesn't serve me well, and I need to know that doesn't serve me well. And here's how that doesn't serve me in a business context. We might not be identifying, we're likely not identifying where our product or service might fit in a community that we're not familiar with, right? If it's 10 40-something-year-old white guys, We need the perspective of women. We need the perspective of people of color. We need the perspective of people who are historically marginalized, right, and not brought to the table, and think about the opportunity there, right? I mean, just the women versus men alone, that's 50%. If we're not thinking about 50% of our consumers, it's insane, right? So we're talking about driving business success and innovation through diversity. That's just one example. And I hope that helps.
A question from the audience. I am hopeful new technologies utilizing and harnessing the energy and power of the sun will relegate fossil fuels to a negligible effect. We're currently making huge advances in nuclear fusion. How far in the future do you think this is away in the making a real impact?
Yeah, sure. So my cousin actually started the Youth Nuclear Conference about 20 years ago. She is also an HBS alum and just a phenomenal person. And their goal is to promote the adoption of nuclear energy because, as we know, it can be done very well and very safely. I think that stigma is the biggest issue, right? The biggest hurdle for the nuclear industry. But I think that as we get to cost parity between fossil fuels and renewables, right then, the economics drive all the decision making, right? As soon as solar is cheaper than coal's done, right? I mean, so we sort of get that. Nuclear, in my opinion, would have to be orders of magnitude cheaper than the other renewable sources before it gains a real foothold. I could be wrong about that. I think that that's where it's going, but all the attention now is really solar, wind, some geothermal. But that's where I think we are at this point in the economy, and I think that will continue to that trend will continue to evolve.
So here's our final question: where do you see the best business opportunities over the next 5 years, and that will allow both companies to deliver financially, serve the world and community well, and create economic inclusion?
Sure, Mark, that's a great question. And so it's funny, on my LinkedIn profile, I think it says something like entrepreneur, investor, and optimist. So the word optimist is sort of right there front and center. I see opportunity everywhere. The digital transformation, the greening of the economy, infrastructure, manufacturing, clean tech, energy, transportation, education, consulting, logistics, retail, tech, healthcare, entertainment. This is the most exciting time to be alive, the most exciting time to be in business. You've heard it 1,000 times, right? You innovate or die. Consumers and investors, they've elevated their game. So I use the term elevated economics in the title of the book. In my work with Harvard Business School, in my work with the White House, in my work with public companies and nonprofit, you see optimism everywhere in regards to opportunities. Your question was about business opportunities. Look,
Yes.
I don't have a time machine, right? But when it comes to economics, I think a little bit of research and the wisdom of some very, very intelligent people can be just as good for dodging, calamity in the future. I think it's important to drive home the optimistic side of this elevated economy. Profit margins and revenue predictions aside, we're approaching a truly thrilling age for business and for those people who lead those businesses. We don't have to lead our companies at society's expense anymore, right? Whether it's providing safer and healthier working conditions or making decisions that are in the best interest of the environment, the choice between doing well or doing good, it doesn't have to be made anymore. That is a false choice. And the elevated economy is here. I think people, after people read the book, and maybe after even this dialogue, you know how your next customers and your next investors' thinking has changed. You know how they evaluate your company before making a purchase decision, how they vote with their dollars. We talked about that. You know how to begin an authentic plan for change, or maybe you will at least after reading the book, and to compete for consumers by telling them who you are, not what you make, not what you sell, right? So this is the world that I dreamed about as a kid before I moved to New York City to start my first company. And I saw New York as this land of possibility. I write about it in the book, a place where dreams happen while you're wide awake, right? And I wanted to be part of that. And I feel the same way now as I did then, right? I feel the same way about the next few decades of economic progress. I think what happens next doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be just great financially, right? It can also be good. You know, everybody is always saying, you know, this is going to change everything, whether it's, clean tech or blockchain or whatever. And I believe that. I think that consumers are the kings of capitalism. As we go, so does Wall Street. And, think about where you bank, think about how you spend your dollars. For me, the business landscape right now is as exciting as it can be. Nothing could be more inspiring. And I hope you agree.
Richard, this ties along with this final question, and what worries me, and we've kind of run out of time, is that people without degrees, and even people with degrees, certain types of degrees, we're seeing a shrinking middle class and shrinking opportunities, and companies going toward robotics, any way to replace the person, the fat and the margins and everything else. Is that a real concern, or do you see that changing too, that there will be many opportunities for people who don't have great science and math skills, so that American dream of, a house, 2 cars, a vacation, and retirement will continue to exist?
People worried about the automobile in the age of horse and buggies, people worried about computers in the late 70s and early 80s. And we have found that time and time again, there are so many more opportunities, jobs created as we evolve into the next phase of our economy. And I do truly believe that it is a very exciting time to be alive. That doesn't worry me. There are lots and lots of opportunities for people all across the spectrum. And I think as we enter into this new phase, this elevated economy, I think that that will continue, and there'll be more opportunity for more people as we move forward.
Richard Steele, thank you so much. I can't wait until you write your next book and have you back again. I wish you the best of luck with this book. And thanks for everybody for listening today. And we'll look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a great weekend, everyone. Please stay safe.